It wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for us to strike Moscow and try and hit the Kremlin now because this is our weapon. We developed it.
After 3 weeks in the Kursk region of Russia, Ukraine says it now controls 500 square miles of that Russian territory, and it's begun a separate attack on another region with an assault on the border at Belgorod. Now, President Zelensky in Kyiv has announced the nation's first successful ballistic missile test, and it all comes after Russia launched a huge wave of missile and drone attacks at the weekend, killing at least 4 people. Let's talk to Zach Anders, who is in the Kursk region. Hello to you, Zach.
Hello. How are you, John?
I'm well, Zach. Hope you're well, and thank you for joining us again. Can I ask you first about the test of Ukraine's first ballistic missile? What is the significance of that to you?
And, Ukraine has been saying for the duration of this war that they want to use Western weapons to strike targets deep in Russian territory. The Biden administration has not want to see this happen because it would escalate this conflict, and obviously Russia would interpret this, push this forward out on the world stage as we are being hit by American-made weapons. We're essentially at war with America, which they've said in roundabout ways, throughout the course of this conflict. But the fear from the American side is that that would actually lead to some sort of red line crossing that Putin would then respond to against American interests wherever. And there's so many different moments where we've said, well, potentially this is a Putin red line, this is a Putin red line, and they've been crossed, like this moment here in the Kursk region with Ukrainian troops moving into Russian territory. That's another red line crossed, and we don't see Putin react with these big, grandiose nuclear threats that he's been dangling over Ukraine for years now. But in specific about the development of a ballistic weapon on the Ukrainian side, there's a bit of concern, and I've been listening to some really incredible commentary on the Ukrainian television here over the last few days about the celebration of this new weapon. And one of the commentators led a long discussion on, America was so concerned about this escalating with our approval or the Americans' approval of using some of these weapons against Russian targets in Russian territory. And we were wanting to hit air bases and strategic bombers before they could take off and hit us the way that they've been. This is what we wanted to use the American weapons for, the Western weapons for. Now that we've developed our own, everything's on the table. And he was saying, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for us to strike Moscow and try and hit the Kremlin now because this is our weapon. We developed it.
Right. Is that kind of strike anywhere near imminent? It'll take a while to move from the point of testing a weapon to firing it successfully at Moscow.
Ukraine says they have already used it and that Russia had no idea that what hit them. Now, it's believed that this was used in conjunction with a drone attack that was targeting some of the oil infrastructure. And we know that a massive amount of Russia's oil capacity is actively burning right now and has been for over a week, at least at one of their plants by one of these drone strikes. So we just don't know how many of these new weapons that Ukraine has built, how many they have potentially to use in such an attack, because it would need to be some sort of a saturation attack with multiple drones launched at the same time to try and overwhelm Russian air defenses.
Right. In your judgment, Zach, you're in the Kursk region. Does that incursion, taking, we're told now, 500 square miles of Russian territory, does that seem to you to have been a valuable exercise militarily?
It's a good question. I think time will tell, but, I've been listening to the programming over the last week here on Times Radio, and one of the guests the other day made a really great comparison about World War I. I mean, we've seen the Ukrainian front lines frozen in a lot of places, but what led to the end of World War I was Allied forces bursting through the lines, marching, I think it was 20 miles in 24 hours, and they had, for the first time, entered into German territories, the first time that the Allies went into German territory through this huge offensive, and they sprinted through, and that eventually led to the end of the war, World War I think about 100 days later. So, you could look at it in that context of this war has been very familiar to World War I. They're digging trenches, they're locked into those front lines, and nobody has air superiority. I mean, we're almost 3 years on, and Russia does not have aerial dominance, and in a lot of ways, they're slipping. We saw that huge energy infrastructure attack just the other day. I saw the fires and the explosions around Kyiv. And that was largely an unsuccessful attack. More than 80% of what they shot were intercepted or shot down, the drones and the missiles. So yeah, this could go either way, but certainly the pressure has been eased along certain points of this Ukrainian front
Yes.
line. However, in the southeast, in the Pogrovsk area, the Russians are still advancing quite quickly,
Yes.
and that appeared to be what the Zelensky team was trying to prevent by incurring into Kursk.
Yeah, I mean the World War One comparison is interesting, but in the when it comes to the overall war aim, it is not conceivable that Putin is going to be forced to the negotiating table against his will, is it? Let alone surrender, which is absolutely unthinkable.
Oh, he certainly could internally. I mean, you would have to think that the oligarchs, the other power brokers, are looking at this and going, "What is the end game here?" Because we continue to be embarrassed. The average Russian citizen, right, is not receiving this information. They're not.
Mm,
You know, a crazy thing happened to me on the way into Ukraine just a few days ago. Russian journalists were on the train. And they're of course they're living abroad, and I'm not entirely sure how their coverage reflects them living abroad, but they were trying to make their way into Ukraine. I walked past them at the border control checkpoint. I'm not sure if they actually got in from the Polish side. But we were talking about, you know, the average Russian citizen. Is this news to them? Are they getting information out of Kursk? And of course they're not. I mean, maybe the family and friends that live in this area are calling their loved ones in Moscow and telling them, we, you know, now live under Ukrainian occupation, and maybe word is breaking out that way. But you certainly don't see any critical analysis on state media or really on the military bloggers, the social media circles that reflects that this is as big of a deal as it is, because this is
yeah,
a massive amount of territory, a massive amount of civilians that are now under Ukrainian occupation.
yes,
It's a building humanitarian crisis in its own right as well. What's going to happen to those Russian civilians over
yeah.
the course of however long Ukraine is there?
Yeah, a lot of Russians now living under Ukrainian rule. And of course, it's true that many Russian troops have been taken prisoner who are going to be valuable when it comes to exchanges of prisoners.
And we saw a really quick swap of some of those POWs within just, I think, 3 or 4 days ago. And that's really remarkable because on the Russian side, the amount of time that has been spent at the negotiating table handling these Ukrainian Russian prisoner swaps has taken months. For certain individuals, it's taken a lot longer than that. But this was a quick swap, so it potentially, it's kind of reading into things how we don't know what the Russian equation is as to why they wanted to get some of those men back from Kursk as quickly as they did. But it's going to be very interesting, and I'm going to be paying close attention to what I'm hearing over the next few days around here because the the Russian equation is everything here, right? If there's a critical mass of people inside Putin's circle who are seeing what's happening, who are seeing the losses, potentially there's going to be some movement here. I mean, we've been
Mm.
talking about a slow erosion of this conflict. Well, this erosion is at some point going to lead to a really quick landslide. It can. You would think. So these moments are just kind of tacking on, tacking on, tacking on, and the pressure keeps mounting inside Putin's circles. We've seen some of his oligarchs making some really pointed statements over the last few weeks as well. The kind of things that they wouldn't have had the freedom or probably would not have said in the very beginning, the opening salvos of this conflict. So I think keep your eyes on Moscow, see what happens next. It really could go either way, but we there's a window here where we could be staring down some really major historical
It's a
moments.
really interesting analysis, Zach. If it's the case that the incursion into Kursk has taken us closer to a tipping point than many people appreciate, certainly people in Russia, doesn't it follow then that was America, were Britain, were European allies to agree to the deployment and the use of long-range missiles into Russian territory, that would push things maybe past that point, maybe could be the turning point.
You know, John, I think the thing would be actually there becoming a moment when the Ukrainians decide to use those Western weapons without approval, without
Mm,
authorization. If they feel like they have Russia on the run here, And in some regards, they do. I mean, if you're going to reallocate 30,000 men, which is what General Syrskyi of the Ukrainian armed forces said Russia is doing today, that they're moving 30,000 men into the Kursk region to try and retake this territory. I mean, we're talking about 3 weeks now that they've held this ground, and we haven't been noting major engagements along the defensive lines that the Ukrainians are building inside Russian territory. Of course, we see the images of the drone warfare and the FPVs blowing armored vehicles up on their way into the area, but it's not like we are seeing heavy artillery exchanges and things like that. We're still probably a bit of maybe a few weeks away from the engagement looking like that inside the Kursk region.
Yes.
But if it does get to a point where Ukraine's got its own weapon now, its own long range ballistic, which is actually more of a drone than anything, a jet powered drone, but it packs the same level of explosives like a ballistic missile would. If they can manage a certain moment where they've really got Russia on the run, they could potentially use Western weapons in conjunction with a large-scale attack and try and strike Air Force bases where these bombers are located, oil plants, potentially different areas of leadership, maybe a symbolic moment where they try and hit the homes, one of Putin's homes. You know, he's been moving reports out of Russia that he's been moving air defense systems around his own homes and
Yes.
properties as well. So Ukraine would be a kind of we're betting it all on red in that moment if Ukraine was to do something like this. But I think it's probably far more likely, based on what I'm hearing, that Ukraine would go ahead and use these weapons that they already have in their stockpiles without Western approval. But that's a big bet, and that would probably mean that there's going to be a lot of partners, maybe even the United States, that would say, well, we won't be supplying you these weapons again in the future because you went against our wishes.
Right, that is so interesting, Zach. I guess we heard it here first. If they do go ahead and do as you suggest is possible and fire these weapons without sanction, that would put the Allies in a very tricky position. We will watch that and hopefully talk to you again about that very soon. Zach Anders there, coming to us live from the Kursk region of Russia.
Ukraine has launched this second incursion at the Russian border. This time it's an attempt to break through into the Belgorod region. It's southeast of Kursk, where they entered and occupied 3 weeks ago. Now, social media in Russia suggests that 200 Ukrainian troops and infantry fighting vehicles had attacked a border checkpoint. And that attack comes after Russian drones and missiles bombarded Ukraine for a second night in a row, killing at least 4 people. We can talk to Catherine Philp, the World Affairs editor for The Times. Is there more that you can update us on, Catherine?
Hi there. Well, I'm afraid there isn't a great deal that's known about what's happening in Belgorod at the moment. We're getting most of it from the Russian side, but the Ukrainians have not confirmed that. I think that you're talking about a much more difficult ask to punch through that border. Belgorod is an area of Russia that from which the assaults on Kharkiv have been launched. So the Russians came back across that border earlier this year and took Vovchansk there. So if the Ukrainians who took Kursk quite easily, or took an area of Kursk quite easily, running into more resistance now, it could be an attempt on their part to sort of distract the troops there, but they're also under huge pressure in Donbass, and they're not seeing as many Russian troops pulled from that front towards either Kursk or Belgorod as they might have liked to happen. That was one of the several objectives of that operation. So essentially to put pressure on Russia in other places and relieve it along the front line.
Ukraine would have known that Russia would retaliate. Is it a retaliation in the way that it expected?
I mean, these attacks on energy infrastructure that have taken place over the last 2 nights, it's been very heavy, mostly aimed at, as I say, at this infrastructure, but it's been much broader across Ukraine than it has in the past. I think Ukraine must have known that this could happen, must have known that this is a possible retaliation for it. What Zelensky has done is use it to ask for more defense systems from the US and bolstering up those defenses against the missiles that Russia's sending.
Okay, so given that, I mean, obviously Ukraine then wants to advance some more, But do you think that it would have changed its plans, its hopes, its ambitions in terms of that advance because of the might that Russia has sent back?
Yeah, I don't think so. They're sort of two separate fronts in the war. They're two different things to do. I mean, the other important factor in these incursions into Russia for Ukraine is to prove that that the most apocalyptic warnings from the Kremlin and from Vladimir Putin have not come to pass. So, for example, he had previously said that if Russian soil were attacked in this way, that that Moscow would respond by hitting NATO countries with nuclear weapons. Zelensky has been able to show that that's not the case, and that is an important part of this extraordinary risk that they've taken in going into across the Russian border. So I think that in a sense, Ukraine is trying to sort of draw the West into loosening the restrictions it's put. They're asking, can we use these long-range weapons? And if we do use these long-range weapons far deep into Russia, we don't need to undertake missions like the one across the border.
This is the first time that one of the big tech billionaires has been just picked up like a common criminal and thrown into the police cell for questioning for 2 or 3 days. It's for defenders of free speech, libertarians and the American right, and also for the Kremlin, funnily enough. It is a question of freedom of speech, what looks like a state attempting to curb free speech. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is, of course, that the French way, which is that Pavel Durov has been aiding and abetting crime by failing to pass on.
Right. So more specifically, if this case goes ahead, Charles, what will the prosecutors be trying to establish as being unlawful? What will be the point of principle that's decided by that?
Quite simply, they're trying to make him responsible for criminal activity that's carried out on Telegram. Telegram has nearly 1 billion users, and a lot of them are, by all accounts, people using it for criminal purposes because it's encrypted. It's encrypted from beginning to end. The French say he is responsible for the content, and he is refusing to cooperate with the French and open up the site as other messaging sites do, like Facebook and Twitter.
I mean, on this question of the accusations leveled at Telegram, I mean, how does Telegram defend itself against the charge, the accusation that their platform is used as a platform of choice by Islamist jihadists, by criminals, by pornographers and others?
They say that these are simply people using a method of communication, just like a telephone company is not responsible for the conversations people hold over the telephone. That is, of course, contested especially in Europe and by the European Union and by France. Although it's a big question whether France can actually enforce this or even will go ahead with charges.
Right. And what about Russia? They're looking on this with concern. Can you just explain that to us? It's a fact, isn't it, that Russian troops use this platform to communicate while they're in action in Ukraine?
Yes, Russian troops apparently depend on it because their own communication systems are not good enough. The Ukrainians do to a lesser extent. And of course, the Telegram is Russian origin, and it is immensely popular in Russia, both for people who are critical of the regime and for the regime itself. And I should also throw in it's a favorite messaging device of President Macron in France.
Yes.
But the Kremlin took it up at the weekend. The Kremlin has a rather murky relationship with Durov because they essentially chased him out of the country after they tried to control Telegram.
Yes.
And now it's perhaps the French suspect is collaborating with him.
It's interesting, isn't it, that Pavel Durov seems to have travelled to France in full expectation of being detained, in full expectations of facing a possible prosecution.
It's not quite clear because this wasn't a full arrest warrant. The French had put out a call for his detention when he arrives in France, but it was not very publicized. It was not a red alert arrest warrant. It's simply that he had ignored summonses. And he was apparently surprised. He landed in his private jet with his 24-year-old girlfriend, who's his coach, his psychic coach, apparently, and was very surprised to be handcuffed and put in clink.